They say trust is the cornerstone of marriage. But what do you do when that foundation starts to crack beneath you? My name's Daniel, and up until a few months ago, I thought I had it all figured out. A solid career, a stunning wife named Lauren, and a cozy home that felt like a retreat after long, grueling workdays. But life has a funny way of hitting you where it hurts the most when you least expect it. Let me rewind to the moment when everything started to fall apart. That evening, I got home late. My boss, Greg Thompson, had kept me tied up at the office until nearly 9 o'clock. The guy could be relentless, but I couldn't fault him too much. I owed a lot of my success to his mentorship. Exhausted and ready to unwind, I stepped through the front door. "Lauren," I called out, my voice echoing in the quiet house. "In here," she replied from the living room. I found her perched on the couch, her laptop open on her lap. She glanced up as I entered, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, almost as if she hadn't expected me back so soon. "You okay?" I asked, tugging at my tie to loosen it. "You seem off." "Yeah," she said with a faint smile. "Just tired. Long day." Lauren's distracted mood wasn't unusual. Being a freelance graphic designer meant she was constantly juggling tight deadlines, enough to drive anyone up the wall. We shared a quick rundown of our days, but before I could fully settle in, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Glancing at the screen, I saw Brian's name lighting up. "Hang on, I've got to take this," I said, stepping into the kitchen to answer. "Daniel." Brian's booming voice greeted me as soon as I picked up. "Glad I caught you. Listen, there's a big charity gala this Saturday. Great networking opportunity, and I need you there." "Oh, sure," I replied, though the thought of spending my weekend schmoozing with Brian's socialite circle didn't exactly thrill me. "Should I come solo, or bring your wife if you want? Always better to have a date at these things," he said before abruptly hanging up. Classic Brian. Back in the living room, Lauren looked up, curiosity evident in her eyes. "Who was that?" "My boss, Brian," I said, dropping onto the couch beside her. "He's roped me into some charity gala this Saturday. Apparently, it's a big deal, and he's insisting I show up." Her eyes lit up slightly, and a small smile tugged at her lips. "A gala? That could be fun." Fun isn't exactly the word I'd use. It's more of a work obligation, probably boring. But he did say I could bring my wife. "What do you think? Want to come?" She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure, I'll come." "You're sure?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," she said, closing her laptop. "It'll be nice to dress up and have a night out." "All right," I said with a shrug. "Just remember I warned you, it might be dull." Lauren laughed, her earlier tension seemingly melting away. As I leaned back against the couch cushions, I tried to shake off the odd feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. For the moment, everything seemed fine. Little did I know, that night would mark the beginning of the end. When Saturday rolled around, Lauren was more enthusiastic than I'd expected. She spent hours getting ready, and when she finally appeared, I was stunned. Her emerald green dress hugged her figure beautifully, shimmering under the warm glow of the lights. Her hair fell in elegant waves, and her makeup struck the perfect balance between subtle and glamorous. "You look amazing," I told her as she descended the stairs, her smile lighting up the room. "Thanks," she said, her eyes sparkling. "I hope it's not too much." "Not at all," I replied, shaking my head. "You look perfect." The gala was held in a lavish ballroom, the air filled with the scent of fresh roses and the subtle tang of expensive perfume. The place was already bustling with high society types, mingling and sipping champagne as soft music floated in the background. These kinds of events were never my cup of tea, the forced small talk, surface-level conversations that felt more like a performance than anything real. But it was part of the job, and I had to play along. Greg Thompson was already there, naturally. He always managed to command attention, standing tall in his sharp suit like he owned the place. With Lauren by my side, I made my way over to introduce her. "Brian, this is my wife, Lauren," I said, shaking his hand firmly. Brian took her hand in his with that polished charm, he never seemed to turn off. His smile was warm, maybe a little too warm. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Lauren. Daniel talks about you all the time." "Nice to meet you too," Lauren replied, polite but with a faint trace of nervousness in her voice. I caught the way Brian's eyes lingered just a beat longer than necessary. The subtle shift in how he stood, shoulders squared in that overly confident, almost predatory way I'd grown used to recognizing. After a moment, he glanced back at me. "You've got a good one, Daniel," he said, his hand hovering on Lauren's shoulder a little longer than it should have, pressing the point. Lauren gave a soft, awkward laugh and looked away, but I noticed the tension in the way her shoulders tightened. "Thanks," I replied, my jaw stiffening slightly. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something about the exchange gnawed at me. As the evening unfolded, little things started to catch my attention. Quick glances passing between Lauren and Brian when they thought I wasn't watching. His eyes tracing her figure a little too intently. Quiet laughter between them over some private joke I wasn't in on. Nothing glaring, just small moments that piled up one by one. After a while, I drifted over to join a group of coworkers, chatting about upcoming projects and the usual office gossip. But even as I spoke, my gaze kept flicking back to Lauren and Brian. At one point, I noticed them tucked away in a corner, laughing like they were sharing something personal, something I wasn't a part of. Lauren's hand lightly rested on Brian's arm, and he leaned in just a little too close. I couldn't hear the words, but the way they stood, close, relaxed, sent an uneasy churn through my stomach. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was imagining things. Just friendly conversation, nothing more. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, the uneasy feeling stayed. And every time I looked over, there they were, engaged in another quiet exchange, as if the rest of the room faded away. The days following the gala, I started to notice subtle changes. First, it was small. Lauren seemed glued to her phone, constantly texting or scrolling. She held it in a way that made it harder for me to catch a glimpse, angling the screen away when I passed by. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe work was picking up, or she was just chatting with friends. But soon, she began going out more. Evenings she'd normally spend at home were now filled with sudden plans. Meetups with friends, events I hadn't heard her mention before. Felt strange. Lauren had never been the type to go out much. Most of her time was wrapped up in freelance work, and any downtime we had, we usually spent together. But now, she seemed to find excuses to leave, more often than not heading out alone. One evening, she came home late, and when she walked past me, I caught a scent. Faint but distinct. It wasn't her usual perfume. This was something heavier, musky, undeniably masculine. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it could have been from someone at the event, just incidental. But deep down, I knew better. My stomach twisted as I glanced at her. "Hey," I said as she stepped into the living room. "You smell different tonight. What's that scent?" Lauren paused for a split second, then smiled as if nothing was out of the ordinary. "Oh, it's nothing. Some guy I talked to at the event must have been wearing something like that." Lauren's smile flashed too quickly. Forced, almost rehearsed. Caught it, but I let it slide. She slipped off to the bathroom without adding anything more, which wasn't unusual after a long day. But this time, something felt different. When she stepped out of the shower, steam trailing behind her, my eyes landed on something I hadn't expected. Her skin, still glistening with dampness, revealed faint bruises low on her hip, just peeking out from beneath the towel's edge. The marks were dark, deep purple, like someone had held on a little too tightly. The sight of them knocked the wind out of me. Lauren caught me staring. "What?" she asked, following my gaze as her fingers brushed over the bruises. "Oh, this? It's nothing. I just bumped into something." I didn't respond right away, but my thoughts were racing. Bumped into something? No, those weren't the kind of bruises you got from casually knocking into furniture. They were too precise, too deliberate. Her eyes stayed down, and her hands trembled slightly as she grabbed the leggings from the chair, tugging them on in one swift motion, hiding the bruises from view. The air in the room thickened, heavy with something unspoken. I could feel it pressing down between us, but I just stood there, paralyzed by doubt and suspicion. Deep down, I knew. I'd seen bruises like that before, on people who hadn't bumped into something. Lauren finished dressing without another word, her back to me the entire time. I opened my mouth, desperate to say something, but whatever words I wanted to find just wouldn't come. Instead, I watched her walk out, disappearing down the hall as if I wasn't even there. I stayed behind, standing in the same spot, staring at the empty space she'd left behind. What the hell is going on? 2 days passed, and Lauren mentioned she was heading out again. Another night with friends. This time it was late, almost 9. I couldn't keep lying to myself. Every sign, every glance, every strange moment was screaming at me. Something was happening, and I wasn't about to sit back and ignore it. So I grabbed my keys and followed her. Keeping my distance, I trailed behind as she drove off. The night air felt thick, pressing in on me with every turn of the wheel. The road she took felt oddly familiar. I tried to shake off the creeping dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach. Maybe I was just overreacting, but as I kept following, that uneasy feeling twisted deeper. This wasn't just some random route. I knew this drive, every bend and curve, because it was the same road I took every day on my way to the office. Then she made the turn, pulling into a lot I recognized all too well. Lauren parked in front of my company building. My heart sank like a stone. What the hell is she doing here? I eased my car down a side street and parked out of sight, gripping my phone with shaking hands. From behind the wheel, I watched as she stepped out of the car. For a moment, she stood there, checking her phone, before making her way toward the entrance. That's when I saw him, Brian. He was already waiting at the door, hands tucked casually into his pockets, that smug grin plastered across his face. My pulse pounded as I raised the phone and started snapping pictures, struggling to believe what I was seeing. Lauren's expression softened as she approached him, greeting him like it was just another casual encounter. But the way Brian looked at her, that wasn't professional. And then, just as I thought I couldn't feel any worse, they kissed. It wasn't long, but it was enough. Enough to shatter whatever hope I'd been holding on to. Lauren, kissing Brian, my boss. I sat there, frozen, as the reality of it set in. A lump swelled in my throat, and I fought to swallow it down. They laughed softly as they stepped inside. Brian turned back briefly, locking the front door behind them, shutting out the rest of the world. Shutting me out. My hands trembled so badly I almost dropped the phone. I snapped a few more photos, documenting it all, before sliding the phone into my pocket. I stayed there for a long time, just sitting, trying to make sense of what I just witnessed. But no matter how hard I tried, nothing about it made sense. They disappeared upstairs, most likely to his office. Just picturing it made my stomach twist into knots. I sat there, parked in the shadows, unable to believe what I had just witnessed. I had followed Lauren to the last place I ever expected to find her, there with Brian. My mind spun as I stared at the building, each second dragging out longer than the last. I felt sick, betrayed, but above all I felt lost. How could I not have seen this coming? How did I miss the signs that now seemed so glaringly obvious? I couldn't bring myself to leave. I just sat there in the dark, eyes locked on the building, as the image of them kissing kept playing over and over in my head. By the time Lauren finally came home, I was waiting. The entire drive back, I tried to piece my thoughts together, to stay calm. But the longer I sat with it, the more the anger and confusion gnawed at me. She stepped through the front door, her face brightening at the sight of me sitting in the living room. For a split second, it felt like any other night. But as soon as her eyes caught mine, she froze. "Daniel, what's wrong?" she asked, concern threading through her voice. I could see it, though, the slight stiffness in her shoulders, the flicker of worry in her eyes. She knew. I didn't answer right away. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out my phone. Her eyes followed my hand, and when I swiped through the pictures and handed it to her, she stiffened. Her gaze dropped to the screen. I watched the color drain from her face. There it was, her kissing Brian outside the office, his smug grin as she leaned into him. the way her body pressed so naturally against his. My chest felt tight, my heart threatening to crack under the weight of it all. "Daniel," she began softly, her voice shaky. I can explain." I cut her off, my tone calm but heavy with anger. "Explain?" I gestured toward the phone. "How exactly do you explain this, Lauren? You kissed him, my boss, and you think there's some magical explanation that's going to make this better." She dropped her gaze to the floor, refusing to meet my eyes. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "It was a mistake, a weak moment." A bitter laugh slipped out before I could stop it. "A mistake? A weak moment?" I echoed. "How long have you been lying to me? How long has this been going on while I've been sitting here like a fool?" She didn't answer. Her weight shifted from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable. But I wasn't about to let it slide. "I thought we had something real," I said, my voice catching in my throat. For the first time, I felt it crack. "I thought you loved me, but all this time you've been somewhere else with him." She looked up at me then, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. "I never wanted to hurt you," she murmured. "I didn't know how to tell you. I couldn't stop myself." Her words felt like a knife to the chest. I stared at her, the woman I thought I knew, the woman I had built my life around. But the person standing in front of me felt like a stranger. "I can't do this," I said, each word tasting like lead. "I'm done, Lauren. You made your choice." I took a slow, deep breath, steadying myself as I delivered the final blow. "I'll be filing for divorce." Her eyes widened in shock, tears finally spilling over. She shook her head, lip trembling. "Daniel, please," she whispered. "Don't do this. I'm sorry. I messed up. We can fix this." I rose to my feet, my chest tight with the weight of everything that had been broken. "There's nothing left to fix," I said. "You already made your decision. You chose him." She stood there, tears streaming down her face. But I knew no apology would undo this. The trust between us was gone, shattered into something unrecognizable. "I'm done, Lauren," I repeated, firm and final. "I'll get the papers started tomorrow. Pack your things. I want you gone." The silence that followed pressed down on us like a heavy fog. She didn't argue, didn't try to reason with me. She just stood there, drowning in the same silence that now sat between us. Without another word, I turned away, heading for the back door. I needed air. I needed to step away. From her, from that room, from everything that was suffocating me. Even if just for a moment. I stepped out into the backyard, the cold air biting through my shirt as I tried to piece together the wreckage of the night. My breath hung in the air, but no matter how many deep breaths I took, the knot in my chest wouldn't loosen. A few minutes later, I heard the faint creak of the back door behind me. I didn't turn around. I knew what it meant. Lauren had packed her things and left. The next morning, I stormed into Brian's office, my fists balled tight and heart still hammering with the rage that had been simmering since the night before. I didn't bother with words. One step inside, and I was already swinging. My first punch landed squarely on his face, snapping his head to the side. Brian stumbled back, but I wasn't finished. I followed up with two more, one to his jaw, the other driving hard into his gut. His chair tipped back slightly as he braced himself, gasping. Brian's hand shot to his face, eyes wide with shock as blood smeared across his lip. "What the hell, Daniel?" He spat, disbelief mixing with pain as he glared up at me. I didn't back down. I could feel the adrenaline burning through me. "You think you can just do whatever you want?" I growled, barely able to keep my voice steady. "With my wife." I took a step closer, looming over his desk. "You really thought I wouldn't find out?" His expression shifted, the shock melting into that familiar smugness. He leaned back, dabbing at his lip with the sleeve of his jacket. "So what?" he sneered. "You think barging in here and throwing punches changes anything? Accusations don't mean much without proof." I cut him off before he could keep going. "It's not just about Lauren." My fists stayed clenched at my sides, but I was done swinging. I let the words do the rest. It's about you abusing your position. You think just because you're in charge, the rules don't apply to you. Brian straightened in his chair, that smug grin curling up again. He dusted himself off like none of this fazed him. "Let's not forget who put you here," he said, his voice oozing with arrogance. "I made your career, Daniel. Without me, you wouldn't." I cut him short, reaching into my bag and slapping a thick folder onto his desk. "Actually, Brian, I've been keeping track of everything," I said, locking eyes with him. His gaze flicked to the folder. I watched the color drain from his face as he flipped it open. Emails, fraudulent expense reports, messages he'd sent to women in the office, ones he thought no one would ever see. "I'm giving you two options," I said, my voice cold and steady now. "You can resign quietly or I take this straight to the board. Your call." For the first time, I saw real panic in his eyes. The next day, Brian announced his resignation. "Personal reasons," he'd said. No one was surprised, but it was satisfying all the same. Lauren came to me not long after, her face tear-streaked and apologetic. She begged for another shot over and over. Her eyes held nothing but regret. But by then, it didn't matter. The damage was done. I couldn't look at her the same way, no matter how much she pleaded. The divorce papers were filed soon after. When the settlement wrapped up, she left with nothing. Not a dime. She had lost her place in my life, and along with it, my trust. Time passed, and a few months later, I found myself sitting in Brian's old chair, offered his position without a second thought. It wasn't the promotion I had pictured, but it carried a certain poetic justice, a taken back control. In a strange way, it felt like the universe had set things right. Lauren tried to reach out again a few times after that, but by then, I'd moved forward. The past stayed where it belonged, behind me. Sometimes, the only way to handle betrayal is to rise above it. And that's exactly what I did.